Chapter 24 focuses on the genetics of behavior. Genetics of behavior is a very complicated subject to study, and the reason for that is because many types of behavior have a strong environmental influence as well as their genetic component. And because a lot of these behaviors are going to result from the nervous system is the one that's going to sense the environment, process the information, initiate a response, and that response is going to be what we perceive as behavior. Much of the study of behavior in genetics and this type of behavior focuses on development, structure, and function of the nervous system. So how well is it working? Many of these studies have been used in model organisms because you can't do a lot of experimental studies in humans. One of these would be mice. They've also done a lot of studies in Drosophila, which is a fruit fly. And they've done a lot of studies looking at genes that control things like fear or other emotional behavior. And they found that in the case of genes that are controlling fear and other types of emotional behavior have been found to be distributed on 17 of the 19 autosomes in the mouse genome. And if you look here, this shows the percentage of the genes on each one. So you can see a lot of them on chromosome 1, a lot on chromosome 15 and 18, but there's a lot on a lot of the other chromosomes too. Here you can see there's a bunch on 7 and 10 and 11 and 14 and so on. One of the ways that they do a lot of these studies for things like mice are to put them in different situations and see how these mice will respond. They can create mice that have deletions of all these different types of genes, and in fact there's a big initiative going on by Jackson Laboratories to systematically go through and delete one gene at a time from the mouse genome in the hopes of trying to figure out what each of these genes does. And so obviously the genes are going to be located on many of these different chromosomes. One of the ways that they'll test it might be to test things like mood. They can put these mice on a little running wheel thing and they will see basically when do they give up. Okay, these are tend to be genes that are going to be involved with things like depression, because they're just going to want to stay in their cage. They may not want to exert themselves and things like that. So it's going to show a lot of similar characteristics to a lot of human behaviors, and these genes are going to be correlated. But again, it's very difficult to tease out some of the differences between the genetics of a particular behavior as well as the environmental influences on a particular behavior, but they're working on it. Drosophila is another model organism, or fruit flies. This mechanism of nerve impulse is very highly conserved during animal evolution, so you can use these cloned Drosophila genes as probes. And one of the things they looked at was they were able to isolate the genes that were the equivalent to the human ion channel genes. And I wouldn't say this is necessarily a form of behavior, but it is definitely a disease condition. And what they found was that this sodium channel gene is defective in a heritable form of cardiac arrhythmia. And so now it's possible to use this gene to screen family members to see if they might be at risk for this potentially fatal condition. Like getting back to humans, so it is more difficult to characterize genetic control of behavior in humans. We can't do experimental studies in humans. We have to do correlational studies, and we have to rely on things like twin studies. So schizophrenia is a complex brain disorder. It affects about 1% of the population, and they have used twin studies to look at the genetic component of that compared to the environmental component of it. So if you look up here, we've got monozygotic twins, or identical twins, and you can see there's about a 48% correlation with schizophrenia in those particular offspring. In the dizygotic twins, or the fraternal twins, it's only about 17%. So there is definitely a strong genetic component to it. There's also definitely a strong environmental component to it as well. And you can see as the relations get more and more distant, here we go to children, siblings, parents, grandchildren, first cousins, and so on, we're getting further and further percent chance to have that particular disease. And we get down to our baseline of a 1% chance of having a disease. So if you are an identical twin and your twin happens to have schizophrenia, you have about a 48% chance of also having this disease. If you're a dizygotic twin, maybe about 17%. So you can see this does drop off quite significantly. So it doesn't explain everything, right? It doesn't go to 100%. So there is a huge percentage of this that also probably has an environmental component as well. They've done other genome-wide association studies to use a bunch of different SNPs. Remember, these are those single nucleotide polymorphisms. And so they seem to indicate the involvement of hundreds of genes. And so it might be a sort of an additive disorder, where the more genes that you have that are affected by it, the more that you are going to be affected by the disorder. And so what you can see here are a number of different genes. This is a threshold p-value. Anything at or above this level is going to contribute to the disease potentially. These red circles maybe, but they fail to reach significance. Anything in green here is probably not a gene that's going to be contributing to this disorder. Autism, that is a big one, especially in the news a lot lately. Like schizophrenia, family studies and twin studies show that autism spectrum disorders are complex, multifactorial diseases, but they do probably have a genetic component to them. Autism spectrum disorder affects about 3.4 per 1,000 children between the ages of 3 and 10. The diagnosis does seem to be going up. The reasons for this aren't entirely clear. Maybe different environmental influences, it may be better detection. You know, there's still a lot that's not quite known about this. So many of the effects that they show would be problems with thinking or language skills, feelings, social interactions, and so on. There's actually been a number of studies recently showing infants and how they, even in infant age, we may be able to do earlier and better detection. Because many of the infants that grow up to have autism spectrum disorder, even at a very young age, have difficulty with things like tracking eye movement. So, for example, a normal infant, when someone's talking to them, their eyes, if you follow where their eyes go, they're looking at that person's face. The infants who grow up to have the autism spectrum disorder typically are going to be looking elsewhere. They're going to be looking at places like the wall or maybe the interviewer's hands or other places like that. They're not going to be looking at that individual's face like somebody who doesn't have autism spectrum disorder might have. So there has been some genetic influence to this, though. The copy number variants that are going to cover 7 genomic regions have been linked to both schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder. And what you can see here, here's one particular locus. You can see there's a couple cases with autism, deletions, but more likely to have duplications at that locus. In schizophrenia, they're more likely to have deletions at that particular locus than they are duplication cases. In the case of this particular locus, autism is more likely to have a deletion. Schizophrenia is more likely to have a duplication. So what we do know are genes in these particular chromosomal locations are going to play important roles in things like the development of the brain, the maturation of synapses, and the interconnection of neurons. And so you can see here there's definitely, some issues genetically with many of these individuals. When you're looking at expression profiles, they tend to show that the schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder are disorders that represent opposite sides of the same coin. In autism, it's associated with increased activity in certain developmental pathways. This leads to increased cell overgrowth, increased brain, increased head size. In schizophrenia, it's characterized by reduced activity in those particular pathways, resulting in undergrowth and reduced brain and reduced head size. There is much that we still do not know about many of these types of behavioral disorders. However, the one thing is pretty darn certain, and that is that vaccines do not cause autism.